start. Let's start. Are we able to go to the next slide, please? So, today's topic is not a topic that's very light. It is something that is heavy, that has affected a lot of people in the world and may have affected us personally as well. So, little caveat, I definitely want to hold space for everybody. And if for any reason you need to leave the room, take a little break, by all means. So our agenda, we're going to start off with our self-care. We're going to start off with a grounding exercise that I want to present to everybody to give them a little more peace of mind as we go into this heavy topic. We're going to do a little introduction, the overview here at Violence Intervention Program. We're going to go through our learning objectives. We're going to present the substance of IPV and mental health and how it affects people. And then we're going to finish off with a Q&A. Hopefully there are a couple of questions at the end. And I'd love to share more information. All right, next slide, please. So as Shamela said, my name is David Bravo. I'm one of the social workers and clinicians here at the Violence Intervention Program, working in the Child and Adolescent Program. And I'm glad everybody's here. I'm glad that I'm able to give this talk and present IPV and DV to everybody here, whether or not you're a social worker, whether or not you're another service provider, or somebody that has been affected by this personally. Great. So who are we? So we were founded in 1984 as one of the only organizations to be founded by and led by Latinx survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence. Now, we provide culturally affirming programs to survivors as they recover from trauma. We give support groups. We try to break the generational trauma that has affected a big immigrant population here in New York, at least, but hopefully this talk goes to people that don't necessarily live in New York. And even though we are a Latinx-led program, we definitely do not discriminate based on race, ethnicity, or gender of any kind. We hope to restore the hope that we have in our communities to fight the battle of domestic violence and help our children and people that come after us not have to deal with a lot of these issues. All right, next, please. So here at VIP, we have a couple of different programs that we offer the community. We have 3 community-based programs in Queens, Manhattan, and the Bronx. We have residential shelters, housing programs, Helpline. We have services that we give people in terms of Home Plus, where we give security services to our service users. We also have specialized programs, CAP, child and adolescent programs, where we give TFCBT focused therapy to children. We also have our social support groups and other resources that we're able to give our users who need it. For example, food vouchers or emergency cash assistance. All right, next, please. Great. So we have our learning objectives. And for one, we're going to understand the impact of intimate partner violence, or IPV. I'm going to be using the acronym for the majority of the presentation on mental health. To understand the psychological, physiological, and cognitive consequences of IPV. We're going to identify unhealthy and healthy coping strategies and coping mechanisms that some of the survivors may use. And we're going to learn about resources that we have available for survivors of IPV, not only here at VIP, however, in all of New York. Next. So first, we're going to do a grounding exercise. And this one, if you're sitting down, great. If you're standing up, great. It doesn't really matter. We're just going to really try to center ourselves and really ground right before we go into this tough topic. So first, we're going to sit up nice and straight. If you're standing up, great. We're going to definitely try to feel the floor. Even if you're wearing shoes, that's totally fine. Really try to grip the floor with your toes. Try to feel some energy come up to the ground. We're going to go up through your body. Take a deep breath. We're going to go joint by joint. So we're going to start off with your feet. We're going to go up through our ankles. Really try to focus on all the energy going into your knees. We're going to go up all the way up to our hips. And when we get up to our chest and when we feel all that energy right into our midsection, all I'd like you to do is just do some light tapping on your shoulders, going all the way down to the tip of your fingers. Doesn't have to be super hard, just a nice firm tap to feel your body, feel the energy go right through the tips. You're gonna go all the way to the other arm, keep tapping, take nice deep breaths, and go all the way to the shoulders and really try to center yourself right into your seat, or if you're standing, sit up nice and tall. And then we're gonna take a nice deep breath, breathe out, and then we're gonna welcome you into this topic. Um, I definitely want to again acknowledge my position in this field. I want to acknowledge my position as a cisgender Latinx man in this field, and I want to create space for anybody that's feeling triggered by any of the topics we're going to talk about. If you have any type of anxiety, or if you have any feelings towards this, please feel free to take a step, grab some water, and do things that you can take care of yourself. Let's go next. So the first question I want to ask the chat, and for this, we're going to do a little waterfall technique in the chat. So the question is, are there any differences between IPV and DV, domestic violence? So we're not going to answer in the chat yet. I want everybody to gather their thoughts. You can write it into the chat, and I will give you the signal to hit enter so we can have a nice stream of answers going through the chat. Okay, so let's give it a couple of seconds. Are there any differences between IPV and DV? You can give us your thoughts, and then we'll go right into the next slide. Perfect. Now enter, and you can hit all your answers into the chat. Great, we're seeing a lot of yeses. DV can be between family, IPV is between your partner, yes. Intimate partner is intimate relationship. DV can be with your child, etc. Partner, mother, yes. Great. So yeah, there is a difference between the two subjects. The way I like to see it is kind of like DV being an umbrella term for all patterns of violence that happen either within a household, and then when IPV happens, it is usually between partners. Again, regardless of gender, it could be between your partners, it could be between spouses, whereas domestic violence includes also sibling violence, children witnessing violence in the household. That is a form of domestic violence that the child is experiencing, or just violence in the household that comes down between different relationships. Father, mother, aunt, and another aunt. So anything that's happening within the household can be considered that. Um, IPV tends to be between the two partners, regardless of genders. However, it is more reported that men are the typically perpetrators when it comes to a lot of these cases that we see. Later on in the presentation, I will give as to some explanation as to why there may be limitations to some of the statistics that we find when it comes down to how these cases are reported. Um, Now, on the screen, we have how DV is affecting environments, communities, and depending on where you are in, I guess, your status, it has a big impact on how it could definitely affect the way you see yourself. Um, Impact on the community detrimentally because of how a lot of the reasons, a lot of the gun-related homicides and deaths when it comes to women come from an intimate partner. So that's something definitely to take into consideration. A lot of the domestic violence takes place within the dynamic of control and power. The one party has the control and power over somebody else using different tactics that we'll get into a little later on into the presentation. All right, let's go right to the next slide. So we have these four types or four different categories when it comes down to physical violence. For example, physical violence, when a person gets hurt or tries to hurt somebody using physical force, whether it be by beating, throwing objects, so it'd be suffocation. It could be a lot of these different methods that a perpetrator would likely use with their partner. Sexual violence, we have the forcing of having sex, forcing of the partner to take part in any sexual act. Doesn't necessarily have to be the act of sex itself. We have a explanation or an example here, like sexting. So when it comes to technological uses of violence and control, so sexting the partner, even though they have no consent to want that text to be sent, or they don't want to receive a specific type of text. Stalking of just complete unwanted attention and repetitive attention given by the person without the other person's consent, and it being chronic. So this is something that's happening constantly, and a lot of this causes anxiety and fear and worry in the victim when they're just walking around and trying to live their life. Psychological aggression is a big one because, as we'll find out later in the presentation, psychological aggression is a leading cause to PTSD in a lot of victims and a lot of the service users that we see. It's the use of verbal and nonverbal communication, with the main intent to maintain or get control of the other person, using tactics that really hurt the other person's emotions and mental well-being, which definitely causes spikes in the likelihood of depression, major depressive disorders, anxiety. Could also lead into more suicide or self-harming behavior. All right, next. So a couple of stats. Um, every minute, 24 people are victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. It's over 12 million per year. There's 1 in 5, according to the CDC, 1 in 5 homicide victims are because of IPV. 46% of women and 26% of men in the US have reported an experience involving sexual violence, physical violence, stalking. And this happens early. I mean, this happens early due to teen dating violence. There's a great resource called One Love that give a lot of great videos, webinars, and trainings in order to talk to adolescents and children about relationships and how to stop this in its track before it gets worse. Because as we'll see later, a lot of the psychological violence, a lot of the symptoms due to IPV tend to be long lasting, even after the person's away from the abuser. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to go through our tactics of abuse. Now, I want to do a little bit of myth busting. In the chat, one more time, let's hold on to that enter button. Um, Out of these physical violence, sexual violence, emotional, psychological, verbal abuse, economic abuse, technological abuse, which one of these tactics do people wrongfully believe to be the sole indicator of somebody going through IPV? So let's pause here for a minute, gather your thoughts, draft it out in your chat, and I'll give you the signal to hit enter. A lot of these tactics can be happening at the same time, but there's one or two in particular that happen, and people think it's the only way to know if somebody's going through some of this. So we'll do another about 5 seconds, and whenever you're ready, you can hit enter, and we'll go right through all of these. This is great. I love this. We have a lot of physical abuse answers. Yeah. So one thing that I always find when I'm speaking to our service users, especially here at VIP and other places that I've been through in my experience, is the fact that a lot of the survivors that we work with have this have heard the fact that or the notions of, well, you don't look like you've been hurt. You don't look like you're being beaten every day at home, or you don't look like you're somebody that should have IPV or domestic violence. And the physical violence is the one thing that we can see on the outside. And this is a myth because, as we'll see, psychological abuse is a big leading cause to PTSD. Verbal abuse happens constantly. Economic abuse, one, the perpetrator has access and control over every bank account, every account that has to do with how they pay their credit cards, technological abuse, where if the person can use not paying the phone bill as a tactic, they could not pay the gas bill, they cannot pay any utilities in order to maintain control. One other tactic I'd like to explore, and it happens a lot with immigrant populations that come into the city, into the United States, excuse me, have to do with documentation, the document abuse and document with being withheld by somebody that's coming in. Either it be an employer that employs people, holds on to their documents, their passports, their residency cards, any documents that they come in into the United States with, holding it with the thought that you're gonna work for me until I'm satisfied, and then I'll give you your documents back. When in a lot of cases, that is not the case. They're not gonna want to give your documents back. They aren't going to want to give you a fair wage. So this is another form of abuse that can happen. All right, next. Thank you. So here is the power and control wheel. I know we have a couple of social workers in the chat, a couple of people that are service providers watching this, and I'm sure you've seen this in the past. However, I like this one because it really gives a couple of examples and ways that perpetrators and abusers and people control their partners. For example, intimidation. So being overtly aggressive in the vicinity of the person at home, throwing things against the wall, screaming, yelling, being loud, punching the wall while they're maybe close to the wall. They may have weapons that they brandish and clean constantly, and they're cleaning it while the other person's sitting down next to them, knowing that they're afraid of the weapon. Threats, as in, if you leave me, I'm going to find you and kill you. They could be threats of just physical violence, threats of sexual violence, and even threats of self-harm. There are many, many times that we hear of perpetrators tell their partner that if you leave me, I will kill myself. Now, one thing I do want to mention is not to take that too lightly in terms of the perpetrator not probably going to do some sort of self-harm. However, this form of manipulation is definitely present in a lot of the cases that we find. Emotional abuse, when they try to humiliate you and blame you and put you down and degrade your character. That's one way of the person maintaining that control. Isolation. So they're going to be definitely checking your phones. They're going to be checking your texts, phone records. They're going to make sure that you're only hanging out with the people that they want you to hang out with. And then also this leads into you not having or feeling like there isn't any support. Blaming. So they're going to blame you for the abuse. They're going to say that it's your fault that this is happening, that they're going to say, why are you making me do this? Pressure to do things which include sexual acts, drug use, alcohol use, a wide variety of ways that they could exert and maintain this control. Like I mentioned earlier, controlling your bank accounts, controlling the cash that comes in, controlling your way of life and the way for you to self-determine how you want to live. And lastly, using your gender against you, as in the way I was brought up would be that in a very machismo household, people have the tendency of thinking that because they're a man, they are allowed or given the permission to act in an aggressive way and in a way that really asserts control. And as we all know, that is a very, very toxic and violent way to live. And people that experience all of these have a very big likelihood of developing other symptoms in terms of depression and anxiety. All right, next, please. Great. So how many of you guys you can answer in the chat if you like, but how many have heard the words just leave, or know somebody that is going through this and the first thing that someone else would tell them is like, well, why are you still there? Like, why aren't you just leaving? Why don't you just leave this person? Go, you have a good job, you have papers, you have all this. Why don't you just leave? And I think this is another word for kind of like, why don't you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality? Where it's not that simple. As we know, when somebody does tell you to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, if regardless of, whatever status you are, it comes down to external factors that are happening, and then psychological factors that are happening. For example, reasons that people may not just quote unquote leave or escape is because they're afraid of their partners finding them and making the abuse get worse. Um, a lot of people that seek services have children, and they have multiple children that they don't know where to go because um, they're afraid of custody battles in which some perpetrators use the tactic of creating uh, a custody war, order of protection. They may lie about the mother or the primary caregiver that's seeking to leave, and which causes it to be another form of victim blaming because of the system, because of having nowhere to go, having the financial insecurity, not having the resources for them to go somewhere. Their partner is manipulative. There is this cycle of abuse, which we've probably all seen. It starts off with things being nice and being in a honeymoon phase where everything is great, flowers and rainbows, something happens, and then the partner is yelling, belittling, creating this tension. There is a moment of space and then reconciliation, whether in the form of manipulation again, in the form of sex, in the form of just apologizing, saying, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done this. And then it starts another phase of the honeymoon, and then it just keeps going. So that is a big part of the manipulation tactic that a lot of perpetrators use. A lot of our population have language barriers where they don't know where to seek help. They aren't aware that there are resources for victims and survivors of IPV, and they just need a little bit of a push, a little bit of a awareness of where to find these resources. Culturally humble work and social work and resources that we give a lot of these victims, because a lot of these victims that come in, they aren't naturally from the United States, and they have different cultures, and culture really plays a role when it comes down to why people don't leave. Fear of stigma surrounding divorce, stigma surrounding separation, whether it be culturally the when you get married, you're supposed to stay together regardless of what's happening at home. And then also not wanting to be deported or arrested. People don't report a lot of these things because of fear of being deported. And that's a big one that we try to emphasize, that reporting a lot of this and seeking help will definitely keep you seeking more resources, and deportation is not something that is like an automatic thing. Okay, next, please. So we have here the impact of how having bouts of intimate partner violence will have on our emotions, our mental health, and our physical health. Emotionally, we'll definitely have increase of worry, increase of fear, feelings of guilt, feeling that it's your fault, feelings that you're bringing shame to families, and it's a way in which you've been manipulated for so long that it's hard to really gather how you're or what you're supposed to be feeling and what you're supposed to be going through. For example, after years and years of going through IPV, somebody may feel that this is normal. This is a normal way of life. If you look at children, when they see this, sometimes they may normalize some of these behaviors, and maybe another reason for them not to seek resources. Um, According to a lot of body of studies, survivors are 3 times more likely to develop PTSD. They're 2 times more likely to develop and exhibit depressive symptoms. 3 times as likely to develop major depressive disorder. Victims and survivors, they are 3 times as likely to have suicide ideation and 4 times as likely to attempt suicide. There's another study done where it's been shown that they're more likely to commit to or to try to commit suicide multiple times. 3 times as likely to develop anxiety, general anxiety disorder, and then 6 times as likely to turn to substances and create a dysfunctional use of substances. Physical health, as we mentioned earlier, there are a lot of times where people uh, go in to seek resources for domestic violence. However, they may not have bruises or they may not have anything happening physically or superficially. And we see that there are some physical and traumatic brain injuries that can happen that can go unnoticed. A lot of the consequences can also include eating disorders, a lot of chronic pain. A lot of these are also brought on by the depressive symptoms that they are going through. Sexual violence may lead to early and unwanted pregnancies, and another way of control is not giving them the options to seek other avenues of parental Planned Parenthood help. For example, they may force somebody to carry on with the pregnancy, even though somebody may not want that, or somebody is living in a toxic environment and they don't want to bring a child into this. They may use this as a way to maintain control. And then also HIV and other unwanted STIs, which can happen from sexual abuse. So I do want to pose another question. Um, we're living in an era of a lot of technology, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, that give us all of these ideas of what good mental health is. And I want to again ask in the chat, what does everybody think is good mental health? I'll give you everybody the signal to add this to the chat. But what is good mental health to you? We'll give it about 5 seconds. All right, let's hit enter and add all of these. Great. Prioritizing self-care is a big one. I think we can all agree that disconnecting from technology once in a while is great. Yeah. Have the tools to get through it. Yeah. I love all of these answers. These are great. So, one definition I like to give, and this is my own definition, is to live our day-to-day life, not with the absence of stress, because stress is normal. Having worries and having fears is normal. Living your life, your job, relationships, um, but you want to live them with the tools in order to face a lot of these stressors, a lot of these fears and worries, to face them and to get through with them. That'll continue to let you live a life that is functional. And when I mean function, I mean whatever is functional to you. And in later on, we're going to talk about our healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms that could, play a role. But something to keep in mind is good mental health can be different for a lot of people. There are people that use a lot of the coping mechanisms in a protective way because they are, in a sense, protective factors that we go through in order to help us not stay in that uh, feelings of stress and anxiety and worry. So I thank you for all the great answers. All right, next. Great. So depression, anxiety, PTSD are a couple of the ways in which we will see IPV affecting people that are going through this. So we'll start with depression, and according to the National Institute of Mental Health, depression causes severe symptoms that affect how you feel, how you handle your day-to-day life, for example, how it affects your job, how it affects productivity at work. It can affect the way that you take care of yourself, nourish, and sleep. I mean, it definitely affects people when it comes to finding good routine to go to sleep and to get restful sleep. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the effects of IPV have lasting effects, even after separation from the abusive environment. Um, for example, after a body of studies, a couple of conclusions were made where levels of clinical depression are still significantly higher after receiving some sort of resource, whether or not it's help with housing, being in a shelter, being in a transitional housing process. The levels of depressive symptoms are still significantly high. And then even after considerable time of getting resources or getting help, whether it be talk therapy or any form of CBT, the effects of leaving a depressive environment are still within somebody. Now, when we find these depressive symptoms with other factors, external factors, they definitely could lead to even worse outcomes. For example, suicidality, a start in using substances. You may never have used a substance in your life, and then when something happens, you may start to use, and it could lead into a unhealthy and dysfunctional level of usage, or increase in substance. You may have a beer here and there. You may have a couple of cocktails here and there, and then after an event happens, or after you are starting to develop other symptoms of depression, it could increase. You may find yourself starting to go to bars by yourself, or and drinking more than you usually would. All right, next slide, please. So, how does depression look like? So, depression can look different for everybody. Everybody has a different way of dealing with a lot of their internal struggles. Some ways that it affects you cognitively or the way that your thinking process is, um, you're persistently sad all the time. Feelings of hopelessness, feelings that things will never get better. Your self-esteem will take a hit, start having low self-esteem, not being as confident. You'll start losing interest and focus on a lot of things that you've had interest for in the past. You may not go to the gym as much. You may not go outside as much. You may not go to the movies as much. You may not do things that bring you joy. And then feelings of guilt or shame, as in thinking that it's your fault, thinking that you're the reason for a lot of these problems that are happening. And when this is constant and chronic happening throughout your life, it makes it worse. And then irritability and anger. So you may have more violent outbursts. You may get irritated a lot more easily. And then we have our somatic symptoms, things that are going to happen in our body physically. For example, headaches. You have a lot of headaches. Sleeping problems can definitely play hand in hand with headaches. Lack of sleep definitely can increase the level of headaches that you may have. You can start feeling lethargic, not wanting to get out of bed, not wanting to do your normal day-to-day activities that you've done in the past. Poor, or you start losing your appetite, you may not eat. You may not find that there is time for you to cook or eat because of other things happening within. And problems with your bowels, whether it be you have constipation or you're constantly going to the bathroom. These are some factors that can definitely present with somebody that is having depression. And I wanted to ask, and we'll go into the next slide shortly, but what are some external factors that can make a lot of these things worse or hamper the recovery process? So we can just put them in the chat if we can think of any external factors that may make things worse or increase uh people recovering. Stress, poverty, day-to-day things like missing the train could definitely increase a lot of these things. Language barriers are a great one. The stigma of seeking help, exactly. So let's go to the next slide. Social media news, especially nowadays, with the elections coming up, definitely a big time for people to feel stressed. So definitely reach out if you know somebody that is feeling stressed because of the elections coming up. But these are some external factors that I have that definitely play a role. Poverty, lack of resources, language barriers that was mentioned, immigration status, and then just policy. We know that when when you don't have your necessary resources to stay uh fulfilled because you are in poverty, there are other things that are stressing you. There are other things that are playing a role in what you define as being your priority. You may be in a area that does not have resources. You may have just come into this country. The language barrier is there. Even if you are taking courses to learn the language or to learn language that will help gain resources, the last thing on your mind with a lot of, especially with a lot of cultures that we deal with, mental health isn't the biggest thing in their priority. Uh, when you're struggling with eating and you're struggling with providing for children the resources for them to be uh nutritionally satisfied, go to school, all of these factors are definitely adding to the likelihood of somebody developing major depressive disorders or PTSD. Next, please. Now, another one that comes up is anxiety. So increased levels of anxiety in people that are going through IPV. So, like I said earlier, when I define good mental health, does not mean that I never want to be stressed out, does not mean that I never want to be worried, does not mean that I never want to have certain struggles in life. For example, you have the occasional anxiety. You have an upcoming test coming up. You have an upcoming workshop like this one. Full disclosure, workshops are something that really create more anxiety because it's a project. Other temporary worries or fears. You have rent coming up. You have other bills coming up. You need to pay for utilities. Winter's here. We need to pay. Sometimes people need to pay for their heating bill. Now, when a lot of these stresses and a lot of these factors become worrisome, holidays, especially with a lot of people that are developing or that are trying to give their children holidays after escaping a domestic violence situation is big. Or if you're still in a situation where IPV is prevalent, holidays can be hard because you may have family over, you may have to put on a face of everything's fine. So it increases a lot of anxiety. Now, when it becomes dysfunctional is when it becomes super chronic, when you start having these feelings of worry and stress, when the outside stigma or this isn't there. If it hinders your progress in your everyday life, for example, if it starts affecting your job, if you start going to work very late, if you start calling out more often, if you start feeling that you're not safe at work or you're not safe going to work. Um, it could negatively influence your relationships. So you may be You may have had bouts of anxiety when you're in a new relationship because of how past relationships have affected you. And that's a big anxiety worry when it comes down to also seeking help and opening up. And then everyday life. How can this appear in individuals experiencing IPV? Next slide, please. So here are a couple of things, and this is not a, these aren't the only ways anxiety can present in people. So for example, consistent fear for their safety, so they're hyper aware of what's going on around them. If they have to leave home because of an appointment, or if they have to leave because they need to pick up their kids, being aware of who's around you, if the perpetrator is around, going to pick up their kid as well. Um, when you're shaking or trembling when you're talking about the abusive partner, or if the abusive partner is with you and you're having an event or something, you're shaking and trembling because they have been abusing you for so long. If you're consistently checking your phone because they're trying to maintain control, when they're trying to maintain a control of who you're with, where you are, what you're doing. You're thinking about your appearance because of past comments made by the perpetrator of how you look. Um, like I mentioned earlier, anxiety about future relationships, isolation. You're worried about how other people would react to the way that to any type of uh, physical ways that you may have been abused. You may be restless. You may be more angry. You may be more irritable. You may have intrusive thoughts and flashbacks of what happened, and just overwhelming helplessness, feeling that you can never get better, or feeling that there's nobody there for you. And these are other factors, for example, shortness of breath, sweating, dry mouth, that knot you get in the middle of your chest when something's happening, when you have a big thing coming up. However, this knot in your chest or in your stomach, otherwise known as like butterflies in your stomach, if they're just chronic and they just keep happening or just happen out of nowhere. Um, other ways of like feeling on edge, feeling that you have to do something, and this definitely plays a role into substance use. Um, you may start developing behavioral where you're avoiding a lot of things and you're feeling unsafe in situations that you felt safe in the past. All right, next slide, please. So trauma and DV play hand in hand. Traumatic events that leave us feeling helpless and unsafe. A lot of events of trauma that happened within partnerships that are violent. They're chronic. They happen on a daily basis. Again, does not have to be physical. Can be psychological, where you're being manipulated, and these things happening over and over are definitely reasons why psychological stress and psychological trauma plays a higher role of people developing PTSD. Next, please. So even though IPV isn't solely physical, like we've already established, um, they psychological abuse has a big impact on PTSD. So according to Dutton et al., symptomatic responses to abuse, including PTSD and depression, were largely predicted by psychological abuse rather than by physical abuse. Um, PTSD is a disorder in which that occurs in people who may experience or witness a lot of these traumatic events constantly, or another series of events. And according to the CDC, you could break these up into four categories. So you have intrusion, which are the thoughts that come into your mind, whether or not they be constant flashbacks, memories of the things that are happening. Avoidance, and avoidance includes avoiding people, places, areas, and that bring back memories of abuse. And mind you, a lot of these memories or feelings of abuse don't happen consciously. A lot of these things happen subconsciously. If you ever found yourself going to an area where you've had a traumatic experience, doesn't have to be IPV or DV, but if you find yourself in one of these areas, sometimes you may just start feeling that knot in your stomach, or you may start feeling like you're sweating. Your heart may start racing a lot more. So all these things can happen subconsciously. Mood and cognition, like I mentioned earlier, uh, feelings of blame and guilt over something that honestly, there isn't much control over. You start just these feelings will just come in automatically. You'll start thinking that it's all uh that it all happened for a purpose, or you'll start feeling more angry and more outbursts. Um, and then arousal and reactivity, where you'll start being a little more reckless and may lead to increase in behavior that can be risky. We mentioned earlier, substance use as a protective factor that can easily go into the unhealthy coping mechanisms in which you can be overdoing a lot of the substances that affect your function. Next, please. So here are more symptoms that we have for PTSD. Um, you'll start questioning a lot of your own reality. So a lot of your reality testing will be influenced by how you've been dealing with a lot of trauma. For example, a lot of the things that have been done, you may start feeling that this is normal, this is okay. You may have feelings of numbness where something happens that typically for other people will be harsh or scary, in which they'll start having big symptoms. But for some people, they'll just start feeling numb because they'll start feeling that this is something that just happens. Next. So, we have our unhealthy coping mechanisms, which include avoidance. Like I mentioned earlier, you're going to avoid going to certain places, avoid going to places that will bring you back to that time when trauma happened. Substance use, you'll start increasing the use of drugs, increasing the use of drinking alcohol. You may increase self-harm, or you may start self-harming in order to regain some sense of control over your own body. And then isolation, which also plays into avoidance, but isolation is you'll stay at home and you'll probably stay in your room and not really want to go anywhere. And I want to let's go back real quick. Thank you. I want to mention, however, that all of these coping strategies are protective factors and a way to protect yourself. I'm not necessarily saying that these are bad things. It's safe to not want to go to the place that we've experienced trauma. It's safe to want to relax and unwind and not have to think about trauma that's happened. However, when it becomes unhealthy is, like I mentioned earlier when we talked about what good mental health is, it becomes unhealthy when it becomes dysfunctional in terms of not letting or impairing your sense of self-determination, impairing your sense of control over your life. All right, next. So our healthy coping mechanisms, it can be social support, for example, speaking to peers, talking to your friends about what's happening. That's a way that you can cope because you'll have somebody to talk about what's happening, to believe you, and to understand that what you're going through is real and it's happening. You could find, if you're faith-based and you are part of a parish, a church, any denomination, speaking to clergy, or speaking to a chaplain, or speaking to a priest about certain things that are happening. If this is a way that you cope and that you find yourself feeling understood, then that's something that definitely plays a role. We have therapy and social services. For example, here at CAP at VIP, we have our services for the children where we do trauma-focused CBT work for them. We also give other counseling opportunities for people that are going through a lot of these instances of trauma and IPV. Other agencies in New York that help you with food vouchers or emergency cash assistance, transitional housing. One important thing also is mindfulness and grounding, and this plays a role in what we did earlier in the group, or in the presentation, where we're trying to find the way that we could regain our control. Sometimes with anxiety, it's hard for us to start thinking clearly because our primitive brain, or the brain that just automatically starts giving us anxiety, is just altered and heightened. And finding a way to keep you grounded as a way to shut that down for a little bit, and then also start using our protective coping mechanisms. like talking to somebody or seeking help. Um, and self-care. Now, I put an asterisk next to self-care because it's so much easier said than done. Um, I don't know if everybody agrees. However, if somebody just tells me, "Hey, David, do some self-care," it's like, great. What does that mean? And for some people, when they're in this method or in this fight or flight response, it's hard for them to find something that is going to keep them grounded. So, or do things that they enjoy, whether it be going to the gym, exercising, meeting with friends, not to talk about what's going on, but just having that sense of community can be very important and a very great coping strategy. So we have our resources in our websites, phone numbers where you're able to reach out to. We could pause on this slide if in case anybody wants to take a little screenshot or take a photo of this. This will also be on Facebook, I believe. So you can have all this information in and give it to your service users or use it for yourself or for somebody that you know that needs it. Next slide, please. So also there are webinars available. So SAMHSA has great resources in which they're trying now to bridge the gap between a lot of these IPV related issues and suicide. Sometimes these things may not be looked at as something that affects the other, but they are. And there are a lot of great webinars, a lot of great resources that you could find on their website in order to increase your knowledge of this. Do you have any questions? I know that was a lot to take in. Um, and we're only scraping, just scraping above it. I know there's a lot more things that we could have talked about, but if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will try my best to answer them. I believe the slides will be sent and you can also find all this entire presentation will be on the VIP Facebook. I'm not sure if if we have a certificate for participation here. Okay. I will put my email in the chat if anybody would like to ask any other questions afterwards. And this is also how you can contact us. Um, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. And we're good. Thank you for all. Thank you everybody for being here, and thank you for going on this journey with me.